Thank you, Tom. And yes, before my life was subsumed by Greece, I was actually a Pentagon correspondent and spent quite a bit of time in Iraq and Afghanistan as a war correspondent. So I do have some non-Greece background in which to address this audience. I actually, unfortunately, want to agree almost wholeheartedly with Ian. It's more fun when I fight with Ian on topics. But if the question that was presented to the panelists here is U.S. foreign policy at an inflection point, I think was what the question was, I would say emphatically no. And I think almost for the exact same reasons that Ian was suggesting. And I think the prism in which to take a look at this is not hawk dove, Republican, Democrat, as Ian says, but the mainstreams of American foreign policy have always been idealistic and ideology-driven foreign policy versus more realism, the Kissingerian looking for foreign policy based on interests alone. And what we've seen over the course of, frankly, the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War has been a gradual, and I think not so gradual in the last 10 years, move away from idealism as a driver in foreign policy, by which I mean democracy promotion, human rights, and a much more coldly calculated look at interest. Now, let's just very briefly have a recollection of the last 4 or 5 presidencies on this. We had in George H.W. Bush, the first post-Cold War presidency, the concept of a new world order, a very ideological and ideology-driven foreign policy. In the Clinton administration, you had liberal interventionism in Somalia, in the Balkans, and of course the zenith of this was the Iraq War under George W. Bush. So you have liberal interventionism on one side, you have neoconservatism, interventionism on the other side. But since the Obama administration, and even since the latter years of the second Bush administration, you had a gradual withdrawing from these grand views of what America should promote abroad and a much more narrow focus on interests. And that is what America First is. It is a cold, calculated look at American interests and acting on American interests only without the complication of ideology and idealism. Now, I would also argue in the places where the administration is looking to be more active abroad, because I also agree with Ian that this is a stereotype of an administration that is disengaging, and I don't think it's true. Let's take, for instance, North Korea. I know there's a lot of hand-wringing throughout Europe. I'm based in London about the intentions of the Trump administration in North Korea. But let's remember, it was the Clinton administration that first became very, very close to military action in North Korea to stop the nuclear program. This is not outside the mainstream of American foreign policy thinking for the last 20 years. Bill Perry had prepared plans to attack North Korea and their nuclear missile programs. And if you look at those who are advocating military action within the administration, it is people like H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, who is, again, career military from mainstream U.S. national security thinking. So it is not so far out of the bounds of what we have experienced over the last 20 years. Now, that is not to say that there aren't differences. So let me just very quickly, before I hand back the microphone, to talk a bit about what is different. And again, this echoes some of what Ian was just saying. There is this sense of the U.S. as the indispensable nation. I think all you have to do is look at Cyprus, where Vice President Biden and Secretary Kerry became very engaged at the tail end of the Obama administration. It was seen as the U.S. as the one nation that could serve as the objective arbiter on major foreign policy conflicts. I think given the rough relations currently with allies and enemies alike, the U.S. role as the indispensable nation is going to decline and perhaps disappear under the Trump administration. There's just too much antagonism going on right now for the U.S. to play a even hand in a lot of these conflicts. The non-sort of hard power foreign policy, climate, trade, I think that Ian addressed those as well, particularly since the action of the last 24, 48 hours. That has obviously changed as well and has a knock-on effect on traditional foreign policy. And then perhaps most importantly is rhetoric. You don't have presidents of the United States traditionally use the kind of words and language that the president has with North Korea, with others. It's just not, it's very, very different. But I would argue that, again, to make the point, and again, because the question posed to us, are we at an inflection point given the Trump administration, quote unquote, withdrawing from the world and China and Russia filling into the vacuum? Again, I don't even think if you look at China and Russia, you see it's an inflection point. China and Russia have long been geostrategic rivals of the United States. Not so long ago, Russia was the Soviet Union and was our most important geostrategic rival in the global sphere. China obviously has returned to an international player where it wasn't for much of the last 70 years. But again, this has been a gradual process that's happened over a few generations. It's not something that just happened overnight. So to just very quickly wrap up, I do not think we're at an inflection point. I think the Trump administration foreign policy is a continuation of a trend that has happened since the end of the Cold War, and I don't believe that any actions currently going on in China or Russia is out of the ordinary. I think it's a continuation of what's been coming before.